Welcome to Tell It Like It Is. I'm Gary Polland. This show is a fresh look at politics and public affairs. Here we will give you the real deal, not biased or spin, or the major media's politically correct opinions that they masquerade as fact. When we provide you opinions, you will know it. This show rejects mandatory uniformity. This political disease is a terminal threat for our democracy and to America's future. Diversity is a good thing. The anti-American mobs out there are not appeasable and they aren't going away. You may not be interested in them, but rest assured they are interested in you. And their target is our country, our culture, and our way of life. Now for today's show. Our first guest is Ross Ramsey, executive editor of the Texas Tribune. Ross is one of the most knowledgeable journalists about Texas and politics I know. I've been reading his work for more than 20 years. In fact, Ross was one of the guests in the first year of my other TV show that I do on PBS. And I'm really excited that he was willing to come on today because he is in the People's Republic of Austin, where last week the city council voted to cut by, I believe, a third their city police budget. So Ross, are you safe in Austin?
Yeah, I think we are. I think we're fine right now in Austin.
Good.
This fight isn't over yet.
No. How did Austin become, based on the numbers, the most significant percentage cut of police services to date? They beat Los Angeles, they beat New York, they're beating Chicago. What is going on there?
Well, there is a big cut here, but there are a couple of other things going on. If you look at the amount that Austinites spend per person on their police department, and compare that to Dallas and Houston and San Antonio, we're way above all three of the other big cities. And so part of this is, why is our police budget so high? And part of the answer to that is that a lot of it is things that the police wish they kind of weren't doing. So part of what Austin's doing, I think, is moving some of what they've assigned to the police to other departments of the city. There's some other things. Park police in Austin are part of the police budget. They're going to keep the park police. They're going to move them out of the police budget, some things like that. And then you get to the real cuts, and they really are cutting a lot from their police budget. And a lot of it stems from the events of this summer and the reaction in Austin and on the Austin City Council to what happened at some of the protests that followed the killing of George Floyd.
Well, if you look at what's happened in some of the cities that have been aggressive in terms of going after the police, Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, public safety is not doing really well in those cities. So do we have reason to fear that Austin is not far behind?
I don't think so. I mean, we've got a couple of things going on here, optically, and this is politics, so optics are a lot of the thing. Austin liberalized where homeless people can camp and stay, and made what was a largely invisible problem very visible. So you can see homeless people and camps in places where you didn't see them before. They're a lot more visible. That's raised some apprehension about public safety. And if you juxtapose that with cuts to the police department, it's not a great political look. It's got the governor and some others saying, the legislature is going to come here in January for their regular session. They're going to do some things to hope, that they say will forestall what Austin has going on. We'll see what form that takes. Greg Abbott also proposed, the DPS taking care of some of the policing duties in Austin until that time. So, they're certainly playing it up. I think there's a political aspect to this on both sides. And I'm curious to see how it's going to play out here.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if public safety suffers. Obviously, it does. It's not going to be good for the politicians in Austin who supported this. On the other hand, if public safety doesn't suffer, then I guess they look pretty good.
Right.
Interesting. Okay. You've been writing about a lot of things as we move into the autumn of the year. You talked about COVID and how COVID is really impacting a lot of things going on in Texas. You talked about kids going back to school. You talked about the digital divide, and you talked about college football. Which one do you want to talk about first?
Well, they all come back a little bit to COVID. And, how does the COVID response manifest itself in this election? We're less than 60 days away from the beginning of early voting in Texas. And I think, the reason I mark that is we don't really have election day so much anymore as we have election month. We can vote for a long time here. And people are going to start making their decisions final, in October. So as we approach that, they're going to be having some kind of judgment about whether they think the responses to the coronavirus have been appropriate or not, whether those have endangered the economy unnecessarily, and what they think about that. And I think two other things that are going to be sort of stand-ins for, not all of us are going to run around with spreadsheets full of numbers and stuff. I think a lot of us are going to be looking at how's it going to schools and how's it going to football field. There are two things that are very visible. If you have kids, or even if you don't have kids, if you've got employees who have kids, schools are really important. And the state has said we're going to go ahead and have the school year. It started in a lot of places in Texas already. Some are holding back until the day after Labor Day, but it's already underway. And we're going to see if those kids fare well, how they do, what happens in schools that open in person, when they open in person, and how does that go. And I think that's going to be symbolic. That's going to be the thing that we watch as a kind of a speedometer for how we're doing on the coronavirus. Are we ahead of it? Are we behind it? Are we handling it correctly? The other one, is that bastion of Texas. High school football's about to start. College football's about to start. I don't know what they're going to do with the NFL. Maybe they'll be as good as the NBA at this. But, we're going to be watching those things. And if those things all flub out, people are going to blame whatever's in front of them that's left. And what's left is an election season. And, if I was on the ballot and I was responsible for the response to the coronavirus and those things were going well, I'd be pretty happy. And if those things are going poorly, I might be doomed.
It's interesting. You talked about schools. I mean, part of the discussion that I thought was missing, if we go into the spring when we had virtual lockdowns, school shut, et cetera, that the impact that this social isolation that we created has had on people, on marriages, on children, on society as a whole. I mean, I can tell that from personal experience, Ross, because I'm a lawyer, and I've gotten hired on a whole slew of cases, family law divorces because the stress from COVID, wow, business disputes because of COVID. I mean, it's, people joke when things go bad, it's always good for lawyers. I'd rather have it good for society than good for lawyers personally. But this is something I've noticed. And so it concerns me about the social isolation that we have created. And, I'm not sure anyone had the real answers of what we needed to do to stop this disease in its tracks. I mean, it's a serious disease. There's no question about it. But, right, I don't think we had any answers. You even had the experts like Dr. Fauci, who was against masks before he was for masks. And it goes on and on. So I'm not sure what the answers are. I do know that our children, especially the ones you wrote about in your article because of the digital divide, that a number of these kids, especially from less wealthy families, don't have rapid internet service, notebooks or iPads that they need in order to work at home. And that puts them at a significant disadvantage, which is bad for everybody.
Well, it's also a big problem in rural Texas. 500,000 households in Texas don't have access to high-speed broadband, and most of those, 460,000 of them, are in rural parts of the state. If you're looking at this if you ignore the politics of this, you've got a real problem. You've got to figure out how to get people who are normally assembled in groups, how to do that in a time of a pandemic, which is dangerous for groups. That's how this disease, how this contagion spreads. And, so you've got that problem. On the other hand, if you talk to educators, they are pretty eloquent about the damage that's done when kids are not in class for a long time. One estimate that I saw, a preliminary study, was that they come into this year at only 70% of the level that they would have expected them to come in had they been in school all through the spring. And, they're used to having kids have some slippage during the summer. They're all boned up on everything at the end of the school year. They go off to the summer, they do whatever they do, they come back, and they're, a little bit behind where they were in May. Now they're a lot behind where they were in March. So the problem of keeping them out of school is a very real one and dangerous to this cohort of kids. It's also, there's an important component of public schools that doesn't get talked about nearly as much, which is sort of, it's almost a daycare element. Those kids are at school while their parents are working. There's 5.5 million kids out there. That's a huge number of households that are affected by this, huge number of businesses that are affected by this. There are a lot of things at play. And, the response to the coronavirus has been uneven and inconsistent, at least initially, because, our understanding of the disease was pretty thin. As you said, The initial instruction was you don't need masks, but you need to clean all the surfaces. We've shifted a little bit away from that. You do need masks. You should worry about surfaces, but not at the level that we were worried about them before. A lot of that's been shifting out from under us, and it's a very hard public policy problem for governors and county judges and mayors and people like that. But in a political sense, if things are going badly, that's gonna go badly for them on Election Day, I think.
Yeah, for example, Lena Hidalgo has opined down here, the county judge, that kids should not be going back to class. I don't know what that's based on, since she has no more expertise in science than you or I. I think that my conclusion on all this is we don't even know what we don't know, and that makes it very difficult.
Right. The question in political terms is going to be when people go to vote, are they going to be happy with the response they've been getting or that they've been seeing from public officials, whether that's Greg Abbott or Lena Hidalgo or Sylvester Turner, whoever that is. And if they're happy, that's going to be good for incumbents. If they're unhappy, it's going to be rough.
And talking about politics, I mean, Greg Abbott has taken it from both sides. He's taken it from conservatives and he's taken it from liberals. How would you characterize how Governor Abbott has dealt with the largely unknown things about COVID and how to deal with it?
I think he's been inconsistent, honestly. The governor's initial response was back in March. We can remember back that far, 300 years ago. In March, it was, I'm going to leave this to local authorities and I'm going to trust them and I'm going to give them whatever resources the state can give to them because this is a big state and we're having a different experience in Midland than we're having in Houston or in Amarillo than we're having in Tyler. He very quickly came in and said, I'm going to not leave this to local. In fact, I'm going to take their power away and we're going to go to a statewide solution. He started closing things down in April. That was back in the days of flattening the curve. It flattened out and the conversation turned very quickly, since we weren't all getting sick fast anymore, to wait a minute, what's happening to the economy? And then they opened the economy way too fast and, faster than he said he was going to open it, and without looking at the metrics that he had promised he would be looking at. And sure enough, the coronavirus came roaring back. We're going to cross 10,000 deaths here in Texas, this week probably. And, that's a direct result of opening things back up, letting people out into the public, without masks and all of those things. Then he came back and said, well, we ought to wear masks after all. He doesn't have the same kind of coalitions going that you see a governor use in things like hurricanes and tornadoes, where they get together with local officials and they roll up their sleeves and they get to work. He's kind of taken this on all to himself. And I think to a great extent, that's going to put the governor in a position to take most of the credit or take most of the blame.
I think he'd rather get credit than blame.
I think that depends on the job he does.
We mentioned high school and college football. I noted the University of Texas and Texas A&M have come up with a lot of different rules that they're going to use if you even want to go to a game. I think that they're going to let 25% of the people in. There's going to be separation. There's going to be separation of when you enter the stadium and how you enter the stadium. It sure seems like it's going to be really a chore if you want to go see a high school or college football game this year.
It's going to be very, very weird to go to a stadium that's only one quarter full. I mean, even if you just start there, it's like being a Miami Marlins fan. This is Texas football. We're used to these stadiums being full.
Right.
You're used to people going in there and back and forth to the hot dog stand or to get sodas or whatever it is. It's going to be a surreal experience that way. And if you watch, how sports have gone so far, we've got two sort of rough models. The NBA is doing their sports inside a bubble. Nobody's gotten sick really yet. They've had a pretty good experience. Major League Baseball has had a very, very different experience. I'm old enough guy that my baseball loyalties predate Texas teams, so I'm a St. Louis Cardinals fan.
Oh my God!
And they've got 17 players out. They've only played 6 games this year.
I think it's fair to say that the Cardinals are out of it. They can't make up all those games.
Right.
I noticed that the other day when I looked at the standings with my wife. I go, oh my God, the Cardinals have not played any games.
Right, and if that's the experience in college football or high school football, that's just not working. And I think it's going to be. We have these two sort of interesting lab tests going on. I think the sports is one. It's a highly visible thing. That's what we do on Saturday and Sunday afternoons. The TV's on while we're doing whatever we're doing. And the school thing is the other one. I think that these two particular lab tests, you and I can speculate about what's going to happen now, but by the time people are voting, we're going to know what happened, for better or for worse.
Well, and then, of course, we have the question that's raised, is there a second wave coming when it gets colder? In Texas, that's like November or December. Other parts of the country sooner. If there's a second wave coming, the economic devastation to the country is going to be worse than the Great Depression.
Right.
And speaking of impacts, government, local government, and state government will substantially be impacted by the loss in tax revenue because of the COVID economic shutdown. So how is that going to play out, assuming that the legislature even can come together with social distancing rules in January?
There's so many complicated questions there. They're good questions, but they're complicated. Glenn Hager, the state controller, has said they're going to be billions short. And his first numbers were, when you sort this all out, the current budget that we're now in is going to be $4.5 to $5 billion short. The legislature actually has the money to cover that. There's, much more than that in the rainy day fund, the state's savings account. But they're coming in January to write a new 2-year budget. The first thing that's going to happen is Hager's going to say, my forecast for the next 2 years of income is this amount. We expect that to be lower than they would like. And they're going to have to write a budget that cuts some programs. If you are doing any serious budgeting in the state of Texas, the two biggest pieces of the pie are public and higher education on one hand, and health and human services on the other. The state, just in the last legislative session back there in 2019, said we'll take on more of the cost of public education to ease up on your property taxes. And they don't want to cut health and human services in the middle of a pandemic. So they've got a real problem here they've got to do. You mentioned coming back into the legislative session. The Texas legislature, the current rules for the House and Senate do not allow them to deliberate or vote telephonically, whether that's on telephones or Zoom or whatever they invent. So they're going to have to get together at least once to figure out what their rules are. And I suspect that they'll allow themselves to have some more remote meeting. But governance in a legislative sense is a big social experiment. We build a Capitol building or a city hall or a county courthouse to have civil debates. So we don't have to fight with swords in the parking lot. We can go into a place, holler at each other, debate, take things apart, put them back together. In a legislative session, it's 140 days. They generally file 6,000 or 7,000 pieces of legislation, and they pass usually 1,200 to 1,500 pieces of legislation. It's a big, giant mass of people in halls. You've been down there for this. They're
Absolutely.
In halls. They're in tight little rooms. They're having close conversations. They're whispering in each other's ears. It's the better they're functioning as a government, the worse they're probably going to be functioning in terms of a pandemic. So they've got a lot of things to balance down there.
That's going to be a real challenge. Any word, or have you heard anything talk in Austin of revenue sources besides raising taxes on hardworking Texans? Like
not really yet. They've talked about sales taxes and expanding those to things that they don't tax now. In fact, the state puts out this catalog of exemptions and exclusions from certain taxes. And if you just closed all the loopholes, I'm going to call them loopholes, but some of these loopholes are things like groceries and prescription medicine and things like that. If you close all the loopholes, the state would bring in another 50 or 60 billion dollars a year. But they're not going to close a lot of those because every one of those is somebody's darling.
Exactly.
I think the first reaction to this will be something like what they did after the global financial crisis in 2009 and 2011 legislative sessions. They cut a lot of things out of the budget. 2009 was covered by federal stimulus money. 2011, you'll remember they did giant cuts. They cut $5.5 billion out of public education. It was a pretty rough time for the budget, and I expect probably something like that ahead here.
Do you think the legislature is ready for bookmaking in Texas, and legalizing marijuana? That there's been talk. Somebody ran the statistics They said that legalizing marijuana like the Colorado law would generate over $2 billion per biennium for Texas. That's
You're going to have to move the public first, right? I mean, we're back to what's your police budget, right?
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of voters are for that. Other states have had pretty good experience with it so far. California, Colorado, a lot of the western states. If Texas is ready for that, it would be a couple of years to bring the money in. If you were looking at this purely on an accounting basis, something like casinos and sports books would be a much faster ramp up. That money would come in much more quickly. But that's money that comes from something else. So you have to look at any tax that you start and say, do we want this tax forever? Because it's hard to get rid of them.
Yeah, I noticed.
And when they're in the position of the only time that they really raise taxes or expand taxes is when the cuts that they would otherwise make are of programs that are really dear to voters. So I think the first look at this is going to be, what can you cut from the budget that voters won't go ballistic about, and what do we need a new tax for if there's something in the budget that we can't cut because voters don't want to. It's basically, you go back to the public and you say, if you really want this, we'll raise the money, but we don't want to tax you anymore unless you really, really want it. That's going to be the game that they're playing.
All right,
and it's particularly hard if they can't have any hearings or anything.
Well, that makes it almost impossible. Well, in our last 2 minutes, let's talk about the fall election. And I know it's anything could happen, but is Texas ready to turn blue like some Democrats think, like Beto O'Rourke thinks it's going to happen?
I think it's a stretch to say this is going to be a blue or a purple state, but the cities are turning. Houston's turned, Dallas has turned, Austin was always blue, San Antonio's turned. The state is changing, and I think you're going to see that in legislative seats and in some of these congressional seats before you're going to see it at the top of the ballot. I would not be surprised to see 1 or 2 statewide offices go to the Democrats, and that'd be a first since 1996.
That'd be fascinating. And then the other thing of interest, the people that are coming to Texas, because we still have all these people moving, a lot of them people are leaving California, they're leaving the homeless problem, they're leaving high taxes, they're leaving the traffic and all the other aggravation. They're coming to Texas. Are they bringing with them the California voting values they had that created the situation that caused them to want to leave? Or are they going to come and adopt some of the things that make Texas special?
I think, my hunch is that Texas is more attractive to California Republicans than to California Democrats. And that a lot of the people that we're getting from California are probably conservative. They're landing in suburbs, and, some of the suburbs are changing, but at the same time, some of California's suburbs are changing. Orange County, which is famous for bringing Reagan to us, is now a purple county.
Exactly. Fascinating. Okay. So you talked about some congressional races. Do you see any that you're looking for potential upsets?
There are 6 seats the Republicans gave up. They basically, Republican incumbents in Congress said, we're going home. In Washington, they call this the Texodus. 3 of those seats are pretty solidly Republican, but a couple of them, including the Pete Olson seat in Fort Bend County, are in legitimate swing areas. And, if things go the way of the Democrats, those could flip from the red flag to the blue flag.
Interesting. Do you think that the violence around the country in cities run by Democrats is going to impact the election in Texas?
I think it could. I mean, it depends on how some of these things like defunding the police and how that goes, how responses go to questions about, civil justice and about police brutality on the other side. Which side frames that fight could make that a big issue in the election. And it also, you have to look at anything like that as what kind of voters does it turn out who weren't going to be here before? Are people going to vote because of this, one way or the other, who otherwise would not have voted? And I think there's a chance that this brings out some young people who are interested in changing the behavior of police on the streets.
Well, in my informal survey of talking to people over the last number of weeks since George Floyd's death, I haven't found anybody who thought what happened to George Floyd was a good thing or appropriate. It's almost unanimous that should not have happened, and that was a breakdown of the police department. Interesting, in a police department run in a left-wing city. So that's fascinating. Anyway, Ross, I want to thank you so much for coming, executive editor of the Texas Tribune. Always informative, always interesting. One of the great political journalist minds of the state, and we'll have you back in the near future.
It's a pleasure talking to you, Gary. Thank you.
And we'll be back after these messages.
Ron Carter Cadillac, Houston's only Cadillac to your door dealer, delivers test drives to your home or office, like the new 2020 XT4 Premium Luxury, only $359 a month, the new 2020 XT5 Premium Luxury, $399 a month, or the first ever 2020 XT6 Premium Luxury, just $499 a month, all for 39 months lease with just $1 down, or purchase and choose 0% APR for 60 months plus $1,500 bonus cash. Visit RonCarterCadillac.com. Ron Carter Cadillac, Houston's only Cadillac to your door dealer, delivers test drives to your home or office. Now purchase the new 2020 Escalade and enjoy $9,500 in total purchase allowance, plus 2.99% APR for 72 months with no payments until 2021. Or drive the 2020 Escalade for only $799 a month for 39-month lease with only $1 down. Ron Carter Cadillac. Visit RonCarterCadillac.com.
When it comes to protecting yourself and your partners, all the information out there can be overwhelming. Visit our website. We are a free and confidential service striving to help you stay informed and stay notified. We are committed to a healthy Houston.
Have you been injured in an 18-wheeler accident, truck accident, car accident? Was someone texting and ran into the back of you, not paying attention? It doesn't matter what it is. Give me a call, Attorney Willie Powles. We'll fix it today. The number is 281-881-2457. Again, that number is 281-881-2457. We'll fix it today. Call Attorney Willie Powles.
Welcome back to Tell It Like It Is. I'm Gary Polland. This is part 2, and our guest is Gary Bauer. Gary Bauer, if you go back in history, was Ronald Reagan's domestic policy advisor. And you think about that, Ronald Reagan was president starting in 1980. It was a long time ago, but he was a hell of a president. Gary Bauer since then has led Family Research Council and now leads Campaign for Working Families. He's involved in politics in Washington on a day-to-day basis and has his finger on the pulse of what's really going on in Washington, in the country, and around the world. So, Gary, welcome to Tell It Like It Is. You're a perfect guest. You're a perfect guest because you always tell it like it is. I'm going to mention on the top end, I read your report every day called End of Day. I've read it, I think, forever. And I will tell you that you put more in less space about what's really going on in the country and around the world than anybody I know. And so, folks, you can get End of Day report by going to Campaign for Working Families. It's free. Give me your email address. Don't waste your time with mainstream media. Don't waste your time with the New York Times and the Washington Post, who don't tell it like it is, because remember, what they write are opinions everywhere. Gary Bauer tells it like it is. You'll know when it's an opinion. So anyway, after that shameless plug, Gary, what is the state of Washington, D.C. today, besides the fact we have Black Lives Matter painted on the street, and what else? Violence, homelessness, God knows what else.
Yeah, well, first of all, Gary, thanks for the plug. And if somebody does want to get that report, it's CWF PAC, because it's a political action committee. So CWFPAC.com. Just a side note, I get up early in the morning and start thinking about that daily report. And I go on a lot of different websites and look at a lot of different sources of information. And by the time my long-suffering wife, Carol, gets up about an hour after I do and comes downstairs, she is subjected to what at our house is called the daily rant. And she just kind of stands there and nods her head up and down. But that daily rant morphs a couple of times during the day and becomes the end of day report. But Carol hears it first. So your question was, what's going on in Washington? Well, a force of nature has been running into an immovable object. And the force of nature is President Donald Trump, and the immovable object is the Washington swamp. And so day after day, from the moment he was inaugurated to be president of the United States, the deep state in this town has been in the middle of a huge battle, floating all kinds of conspiracy theories, just crazy things, most notably the collusion with Russia conspiracy theory, and that's been shown to be a huge lie. But the battle has gone on, and now we've got something added to that in recent months, and that's these neo-fascists that have taken to the streets of Washington, D.C. and multiple other cities around the United States. Interestingly, Gary, as you know, some of them call themselves Antiva, which stands for anti-fascist, but in fact, they regularly deploy fascist tactics of intimidation, literal physical violence. They attack America's memorials and statues. They attack people that dare to disagree with them. And it's happening all over the country, and it's happened right here in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C.
So, I mean, what kind of history does a country have if these know-nothings are tearing down statues left and right, regardless of who it is? So we have statues torn down for people who are abolitionists, who fought slavery, who freed the slaves, right? They tore them down. It didn't matter. You know, originally said, oh, we're against these Confederates, so we're going to tear them down. But obviously, they're just trying, it's the tear-down culture. I guess they want to say that America was founded on a lie, that America is not the shining city on the hill that our president, once and forever, Ronald Reagan, said. I find it very disheartening as to whether or not our next generation is going to learn American history. And look, these people want to add other stuff in, that slavery was bad, or that African Americans were not always treated in a way that we should be proud of. I don't have a problem with that, but it's interesting. You know, I'm old. I mean, older. You're older. When I was in high school, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. This was in the late '60s, early '70s, right? So, okay, yeah. and that was okay. It was something else to read and get a different perspective. But these people make it sound like, Gary, we've hidden this. It's like something we're ashamed of. We'll lock it away in the closet. We'll never talk about it. And now this has to come out, and this really has to be talked about all the time. And we're going to ignore the rest of American history.
Well, you know, the president was right, as he so often is, when these kinds of issues came up. And as you alluded to, Gary, it started with taking down Confederate statues of Robert E. Lee or Southern war heroes. And the president said, you wait, he said, before this is over, they'll be tearing down George Washington and the founding fathers. And of course, he was roundly mocked for saying that, but he was absolutely right. I would go a step further and say that this never had anything really to do with Confederate statues or Robert E. Lee. The people doing this are not against the Confederate flag. They're against the American flag. They're trying to tear down not the old reconstructed South that has long since disappeared. They're trying to take down America. And quite frankly, when they tear down statues or attack statues of the founding fathers, when they deface the Lincoln Memorial, when they try to burn down a church right across Farragut Square or Lafayette Square from the White House, when they're doing those things, they're just really, it's almost a symptom, Gary, because All those things have been torn down and destroyed in the classroom for decades. And now these rioters in the streets are a product of being in those classrooms and seeing and hearing from their teachers that America is an evil country. So, of course, now they go out and they attach the memorials, they attack the history of the United States. And by doing that, they're showing us what their ultimate goal is. It's not social justice, it's power. And they want to transform America. They want to rip it out of its Judeo-Christian roots. And that's why, one of the reasons why this election is so very important.
It's interesting. Do you think that John F. Kennedy or even Bill Clinton, if they were being honest, and if John F. Kennedy, if he was alive, would recognize the current Democratic Party and the aid and comfort it has given to these people who want to deny America?
Hey, look, in some ways, Barack Obama may not fully recognize this Democrat Party. I mean, they've gone so far left. I'm not sure the campaign he ran for his first election would pass muster today. As you'll recall, when Barack Obama ran the first time, he was against same-sex marriage.
I remember.
Now, he wasn't really, but he told everybody he was. Today, if you're a Democrat and you're against same-sex marriage, they'll run you right out of the party.
Well, they run you out of the party for all the any number of issues.
Yes, absolutely correct. No, it's not. I was starting to say it's humorous, but it's actually very frustrating to see the media suggest that the Republican Party has moved too far to the right, that we've abandoned our traditional conservative ideas, and now conservatives and Republicans are extremists. I have the same views. I suspect you do too, that I had 30 years ago. But 30 years ago, 35 years ago, even though we had disagreements with the Democrats over the size of government and whether taxes ought to go up or down, there wasn't a lot of disagreement about things like religious liberty or whether marriage was a man and a woman. There wasn't much disagreement about the idea that America, with its flaws, was still a great country. I mean, flawed, but compared to what other country, right? What country in the world has a history as glorious as ours? What civilization other than Western civilization?
Well, there's
Judeo-Christian
Gary. Well, there's
civilization.
Venezuela, and Cuba, and
Right.
these other states that failed states that the Antifa crazy mobs embrace. I don't know. It's kind of like they're living in a world I don't see that's out there, and you worry because the major media has bought into this to the full extent. I mean, the full extent, such an extent that the New York Times gets rid of a liberal Democratic opinion writer, right? Because she
Yes.
happens to be pro-Israel. Otherwise, she buys into the rest of the left-wing agenda. They run her off. She quits because there's no opportunity or interest in diverse opinions at the New York Times. And their editorials, they start on page 1 and they go all the way through the paper. It doesn't end. And that's why, you didn't hear my introduction. My introduction says the major media confuses opinions with facts. And they do it all the time, everywhere. And that is a serious problem. And we can't even agree on what the facts are. How can you even have a discussion? And then you have the Democratic Party leadership in Washington, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and the rest of the geriatric crowd. Those people could not even get their Democrats to vote to condemn anti-Semitism without condemning every other nasty thing that's out there. Couldn't get the votes because they have and supported anti-Semites who got reelected. The squad, all the squad, and AOC and her band of cutthroats are all anti-Semitic. They are. And yet they don't get called out. And nobody, I don't know. I don't get it.
Well, you may remember this, Gary, when Ilhan Omar, the congresswoman from what is called Little Mogadishu, that's what part of her congressional district is called in Minnesota, because so many Somalians were brought in under President Obama and Vice President Biden into that area of Minnesota that it now resembles little Mogadishu in Somalia. Well, when Ilhan Omar was spouting some of her anti Semitic nonsense and her hatred for Israel, when many of us here in Washington were critical of her and tried to get a resolution through Congress that would condemn her, I was reminded today that Kamala Harris actually publicly said not that she was worried about the anti Semitism, but that she was worried about Ilhan Omar and her safety because people were singling her out for her anti Semitism. So Kamala Harris, who defended Ilhan Omar, is now the moderate Joe Biden's running mate to be one heartbeat away from the presidency of the United States.
Yeah, and speaking of Kamala Harris, look, she's bright, she's articulate. I'm sure she was had good lawyer skills. But if you look at her record, she has the most liberal voting record this year in the U.S. Senate. Top 3 or 4 over all the sessions she's been in the U.S. Senate. So how in God's green earth can she be considered a moderate unless we're going to compare her to who? Lenin? Stalin? Putin? Who? I don't get it. But that's the spin the media puts in. She is actually part and parcel of the radical left, except when she was a prosecutor, she treated people bad. Trump took care of the folks who were treated badly by the criminal justice system. Kamala Harris helped suppress evidence that would let the innocent go free, instead get found guilty. That's her claim to fame. So somehow this lady is the revelation coming forward. I mean, I hope Mike Pence is ready to treat her with respect, but also not let her get away with anything.
Well, I just saw the vice president the other day, and he seems to be really up for it, Gary. I think we're going to see a great debate performance. But you mentioned, how can anybody call Kamala Harris a moderate? And it was the New York Times on the front page that said that she was a pragmatic centrist. And I suppose if you're on the editorial board of the New York Times, she may look like a pragmatic centrist compared to some of the Marxists.
Well, she's for cutting police funding, and I mean, there's so many things that are wrong with her. It's unbelievable, and I hope. And it's not Trump's job to do it, obviously. It's really Pence's job and surrogates to do it. Trump needs to be concentrating on Joe Biden. Let's talk about a wonderful accomplishment for President Trump and the administration, and that's the peace treaty between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. That's the first Gulf state that's made peace with Israel. That is like huge and off the charts. And what bothers me is I watch the Sunday talk shows, and I watched CBS, and I won't even mention her name. I'll mention her first name, Norma. She is so biased and so prejudiced, it's breathtaking. And you can tell when she's interviewing someone, she doesn't share their position. She treats them, interrupts them. She's condescending, right? When she has someone she interviews who she agrees with, she's like a lapdog. This is the idea of objective Sunday talk shows. I mean, and she's just one of the many that are examined. Heck, I think George Stephanopoulos, to be honest, is much fairer than this lady. Anyway.
Yeah. He's an old line Democrat. He looks fair compared to some of the new ones. You're absolutely right.
He does. Okay, so this accomplishment, how significant is it in the big picture?
Well, I think it's very, very significant. First of all, as I'm sure your viewers know, and I know you know, President Trump and Vice President Biden and Vice President Pence, are the most pro-Israel president and vice president in the history of the United States. And I say that having worked for Ronald Reagan. The president, this administration has done great things for the nation of Israel. We've restored that alliance. The United States and Israel are the two pillars of Western civilization. We believe in the same values, and we stand together. We got the same enemies around the world. For decades, there were moderate nations in the Middle East. I know that's hard to believe, but there are a few of them who were afraid to recognize Israel and to have normal diplomatic relationships with them because they thought that if they did that, they might not wake up one night, the rulers of these nations, if after they went to bed, that they would be killed by the extremists in their own nations. But President Trump has so moved the whole situation in the Middle East by taking on Iran, by getting out of the Iran nuclear deal, which was a disaster, by making it clear that Israel is not going anywhere. Israel, the Jews are living where they've been for thousands of years. They're going to stay there no matter how many people refuse to recognize them. It is a reality. And so now some of these nations are beginning to, at some risk to themselves, formally recognize Israel. I believe between now and the election, there's a good chance we'll see 2 or 3 other nations, Muslim, Arab nations in the Middle East, do the same thing. And this is the first real significant peace deal in the Middle East, all the way back to I guess, probably the Clinton administration. It's a huge development. And quite frankly, Donald Trump should be giving the Nobel Peace Prize, the one that Barack Obama should have never received, Gary.
Well, he got that because of what he was going to do, not because of what he did, and then he didn't deserve it anyway. But yeah, I think it's a tremendous accomplishment. I think again, major media has underplayed it. All right, let's talk about All right, we're down to 1 minute, Gary. Time flies, and we will obviously have you back periodically as we sit here. 60 days from when voting starts in Texas and other parts of the country, some earlier. What is your take on this election? Is there a silent group of voters out there that don't want to argue with their friends that don't like Trump, but are going to turn out in massive numbers and reelect the president? Or are we going to elect closet Biden, who won't come out and really campaign, won't meet with the media, won't have a press conference without pre-selected questions and answers on his teleprompter?
Well, I think Donald Trump and Mike Pence are going to win. Whether they get to retake the office for a second term remains to be seen, depending on how much fraud and cheating takes place. But I do believe, Gary, that as people are beginning to pay attention, they're coming back to the president. There's a new poll out just in the last couple of days that shows that the lead in CNN had for Biden of 14 points is now down to 4 points. And this hidden vote idea, I know a lot of people in Northern Virginia who are afraid to put up a sign for the president, afraid to say anything publicly about it. And I assume if they're afraid to do that, they're probably afraid to tell a pollster they're going to vote for him, but they will be there on Election Day.
Well, on that note, Gary, I want to thank you so much for being on. Gary Bauer, head of Campaign for Working Families. Remember, it's Gary, give out your email because you should get his newsletter.
It's CWF PAC, P-A-C, CWFPAC.com. Great to be with you, Gary.
And if, by the way, if you like his work, you ought to support his efforts. He's very effective in how he spends precious resources. People care about the future of this country. Gary, God bless you for the work you do.
And you too.
Thank you. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week at the same time and place. You can email the show at GaryPolland@AmericaStarTV.com. You can get my bi-weekly newsletter, the Texas Conservative Review, by Gary Polland, by signing up for free at TexasConservativeReview.com. Remember, in the immortal words of President Ronald Reagan, you and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We will preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we will sentence them to take the final step into 1,000 years of a new dark age. I hope and pray that never happens. I'll see you next week.